So first, you need to understand the technology, and then you would need to know PowerShell, right? Because that's the backend. So over here, let's say this is just your computer, right? No Azure, nothing. This is your computer.
Mm.
Okay. Now, if this is your computer, you first interact with your operating system.
Mhm.
Now, you you usually use your computer to probably access the web or do computations on it, right? You use multiple applications. I mean, there's many software and everything. Operating system is another software, but you use a computer to do things quickly, right? That's what a computer is meant for.
Mhm.
Accessing the web and using applications like Word and stuff like that is just another part of a computer. A computer is something that can compute things at a much faster pace than human beings,
Mhm.
right? Back in the days, there used to be a job as well. You were a computer, so your job was a computer, and people would come to you with different tasks to do, and you would compute those tasks and calculate things like that, right? So that was a
Right.
computer. Now, from after computers are limited to what it can do, right? So after computers, we had servers. Us, I'm not sure if I covered this with you in the past. A server is a computer that can provide services to other computers.
Other computers.
The
That's correct.
the only difference is the operating system is different. It's meant to handle workloads for other computers. Your RAM is, of course, much faster so that it can do processes,
Correct.
so that it could do multiple processes and cater to other computers, right? The
Mm.
different types of servers. So one that mostly we talk about is your Active Directory server. Active Directory has multiple roles. The main one that you will deal with is ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services.
Mhm.
So because it's Active Directory Domain Services, it creates a domain. So whenever you purchase a computer, you load your operating system, you get an option to add your computer to a work group or a domain, right?
Mm.
So if it is added to a domain, that means your computer is added to an Active Directory. So your computer will have a user account, right? It'll have a username, which is probably your name, first name dot last name at domain.com or domain backslash
Mhm.
and then you enter your password. So with that, your computer is domain joined to this server. The reason is domain joined to the server is so that an administrator, yeah, this is an admin, can manage these user accounts from one location. So
Mhm.
you would, on this computer, you would have users, groups, computers, and objects, right? And it
Mhm.
would take care of all these objects. It makes management much easier. Now, this is one where
Correct.
you can, this ADDS manages your computer, so it's a domain service. And the other one is you add it to a work group. Your work group is mostly you will have it at home, right? So you would
Mm.
probably have one or two computers over here at home, maybe yours, your dad's, your mom's, laptops and stuff like that, right? But you all want to use the same printer, right? Let's say you're still using printers, then maybe you'll want to use a printer, right? Fax machine,
Correct.
things like that. So if this is added in a work group, all these things are added in a work group, you can you can network your location in such a way that you have multiple routers. Each router has a different name and stuff, but everything is added in a work group. So you can use collectively use these services. So in an
Correct.
office environment, you would it's much larger, right? It's more than two, three computers, like maybe 50 or even 100 computers. That's better to have Active Directory where an administrator can go in and manage things for you. Now, this is one of the servers that we just talked about. Now, let's say we go to Azure, right? What is Azure? It's the same thing. It's the server. We install ADDS on it, right? We move this to the cloud. So this one becomes Azure Active Directory, AAD.
Mm.
Now this is AD, which is on-prem. Move to the cloud, it is AAD. What is
AAD.
a cloud? A cloud is just something that you've rented from a different or larger provider. So this
Correct.
AAD is also another server somewhere, probably usually save them or use these underground locations or probably under the sea and stuff like that. But they're usually
Mm.
different locations. You're basically remoting into a different server, right?
Got it.
Or you're basically accessing Microsoft's cloud or Microsoft servers, not Microsoft's cloud, Microsoft servers. So you are just using Microsoft servers over here when you talk about Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is nothing but Microsoft's cloud service,
Got it.
or you're accessing another computer somewhere else, right? Now, when we want to understand the technology, first you would understand this operating system. So when we talk about and what they do is you make it look nice, right? There's a web page to it, Azure Active portal.azure.com. You go ahead and log in over there. You can see the different services that Microsoft has to offer. One of the services is Azure Active Directory. Then you have multiple other services like I guess they have blob storage containers. You can create different virtual machines. You can have Azure data factories, things like that. There are multiple other services. They are just nothing but your on-prem solution taken to the cloud, right? Azure Active
Mm.
Directory is just one of those services, which we is ADDS.
Okay.
Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So that's
Mm.
ADDS taken to the cloud is Azure Active Directory.
Azure Active Directory. Yeah.
Correct. Perfect. So now, just like I think we talked about this in probably our first session. So if you do have SharePoint, right, a SharePoint as a service, you take that to the cloud, it becomes a SharePoint Online, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's and that is why, since you are renting or since you're purchasing this service from Microsoft for that certain period of time, that's why it is a rented space. All right.
Mm.
So it's that's why everything is tagged to a subscription. So if you
Okay.
realize when you go online, right, everything is tagged to a subscription so that
Mm-hmm.
it makes billing easier, right?
Okay.
Renting
Like
things
for
from
example,
Microsoft.
maybe
Go ahead. Go ahead.
just like we have examples of uh, Netflix or Amazon, they
Yep.
have their own, all the data that they have in form of different movies and web series, and you
Correct.
can probably look out for different types of subscription for maybe a month or premium
Exactly.
subscription, prime subscription, these things and all.
Exactly. Amazon Prime, you have
Amazon Prime, yeah.
Amazon Prime, you have Netflix, you have so many other things. You're renting these
Mm-hmm.
movies. Back in the days,
Correct.
I guess before 2000, it was Blockbuster. You went into a store in the US at least, you
Mm-hmm.
or even in India, you went into a movie, I guess, cassette shop. You purchased or rented a cassette for a week, right? You paid the guy, and then you came home, watched that cassette, and then you returned it, right?
Return it back, yeah.
You rented it back in the days. In the US, they had Blockbuster, where you go in and you rent out a movie and watch it for the week, and then you give it back. Now,
Okay.
what Netflix did is they took everything to the cloud, right? I mean, they have everything. You technically, when you purchase these subscriptions, you are renting these movies out. So when you purchase a Netflix subscription for, let's say, a month, you get access to what more over 100,000 plus movies, right?
Mm.
And if you were to go into a Blockbuster store or your usual cassette store, it would cost you much more money to have an option like that, right?
Mm.
But yeah, so that's when you rent out space. So same thing with SharePoint, with Exchange, with EXO. Oops, Z. So Exchange as well. You take it to the cloud, it becomes Exchange Online. You're renting
Okay.
out this mailbox space, right? So whenever you rent out stuff, it becomes cloud. It's nothing is in the cloud, it is just at a different location. Yeah.
Mm.
So this is the technology. Now, if I want to do things with the technology, you can do things using the browser, which is either portal.azure.com or portal.office.com. You can go ahead and use the browser and you can do things, right? But if I want to do bulk operation, or if I want to really get into nitty gritties of it and do some proper troubleshooting, that is when you use PowerShell. That is when you use PowerShell. Yeah. So when I use PowerShell, I am basically remoting into a different server.
Mm-hmm.
So PowerShell is enabled on that computer or that server, and because remoting is enabled, I'm sorry, remoting is enabled. So because remoting is enabled, I can remote into a different machine. So let me just Control Z. So let's do this, right? This is your space, and this is Microsoft space. So this is your computer here.
Mm-hmm.
This is your computer, and this is Microsoft space, right? So let's say these are Microsoft farms, servers, all right? So Microsoft has enabled remoting. And because of that, your machine can go ahead and remote into Microsoft's machine. Let's do this.
Okay.
So because of remoting being enabled, your machine can go ahead and remote into Microsoft's machine.
Mm.
And that is when you can perform bulk actions like you can either interact with the users you have, you interact with the services that you have purchased or rented out for that time. Yep. Now, there are two ways that you can do that. Either by downloading and installing the module or using an endpoint. I believe we had discussed this as well, right? So one is downloading and installing modules, which are wrappers around your endpoints.
Mm-hmm.
So over here, you need to connect to it, right? So that's why you run your command connect hyphen Azure AD or connect hyphen something. But Microsoft has a different location. Let's say this is your PowerShell gallery, where you will download these modules onto your system. So
Okay.
that's why I think in our second session or first session I told you to download and install some modules, right? And
Correct.
that's when we talked about setting up your environment. We talked about PowerShell. PowerShell
Mm-hmm.
is that tool that Microsoft provides for you to interact with different computers. Then I'd asked you to download and install some modules. One of them was Azure AD module, Azure AD
Azure AD
Preview.
modules. Yeah.
You had Microsoft Graph, you had AZ module. You have multiple modules that you can download and install from this PowerShell location.
Mm. So you had
So
asked us to download multiple modules, right? Like not just
exactly.
AZ modules, but other modules as well. I mean,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
just
yeah.
Azure AD modules, but other modules too.
Correct. Because right now you might be dealing with Azure Active Directory, but in the future you could deal with SharePoint. In the future you could deal with Exchange. In the future you could deal with other technologies, right, or other
Mm-hmm.
services that Microsoft has to provide. Now, when we talk about Azure Active Directory, there are basically three types of or three modules that you would consider. One is Azure. One is the Azure AD,
Mm-hmm.
right? The second type is AZ module, and the last type is Graph.
Mm.
Oh yeah, and yeah, there's one more which is MSO. So back in the days, it was MSO. Then we got to Azure. Now then it became AZ. Now it is Graph. This is the newest module, and I would really suggest that instead of spending your time working with Azure module, MSO module, or AZ module, to invest your time wisely and spend time learning Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph, it's the same thing. It's the same type of commands as well. So you would go ahead and let me get that same color. You would go ahead and download and install the MG module. So the Microsoft Graph, right? Once
Mm.
you download that, there's a slight change in commands, but the output you get is much better. A slight change in commands, which is if this was get hyphen MSOL user, right? For MSOL is
Mm.
get hyphen MSOL user. This one is get hyphen Azure AD user, if I'm not mistaken. This one is get hyphen AZ AD user, and this one is get hyphen MG user. Yeah, I mean they're similar, because they're all wrappers around your endpoints, right?
Correct.
So you can either do this, which is download and install the module, and that is perfect. It's much easier if you download, install the module. You can run your commands, which is get hyphen mg user, and with that mg user, you can do things. Or you
Hmm.
can interact directly with this endpoint here, right? So you'll have a
Got it.
graph endpoint. You would interact directly with the graph endpoint. So if I would go over here, and the best way for you to check this is if I just Google or Bing, yeah. So if I this Google it and just do MS Graph API END endpoints. So you come over here. These are endpoints, right? You have version 1.0 and you have a beta here. So there are two. Try using version 1.0 because this is stable. Beta is something which they are doing testing in, so it could change at any time. Yep. Now look at how we interact with this. One is by downloading this module and doing it, or you can interact with these endpoints directly. You have your Graph API endpoint, graph.microsoft.com, then you have your version, then you have the resource you interact with, and then your query parameters, which are filters usually. Yep.
Correct.
So if I look at users, if I want to get users, I would use, let's see, I would don't want, yeah, rather than getting one user, this is get one user, which is get hyphen mg user hyphen and then the ID of the user.
Hmm.
Or you can list all users. That is also get hyphen mg user, and you can do that. But if I'm interacting with the endpoint, it would just be the resource, right? That endpoint of the resource would be users. So the query that you would do is right here. This is the URL that you or URI that you interact with. Now, if you look at Microsoft site, we have HTTP. You can either interact with it using HTTP. You can do it using C Sharp, Java, Go, PHP, or if you want PowerShell, this is their command, right? You import module, Microsoft Graph. The resource over here is users. And then you do get -mg user, which will give you all the users in your environment. All right.
Hmm.
But yeah, you can interact with this like this, which is easier since if you're just getting started with PowerShell, do this. If you want to take it up a notch, start learning this, interacting using endpoints,
Okay.
because the filters are much easier, right? Because the filters, when you interact with HTTP endpoints, are more targeted compared to PowerShell. For PowerShell, I would pipe, right? So I would first get all the users in my environment, and then I do something with it, right? So you use a pipe command. So get hyphen mg user hyphen all. After I get all the users, then I would filter. So first it processes the users, which are, let's say, all the users in your environment, and then I do something with it. Instead of doing that, which uses a little more power on your computer and is a little slower, you can do this directly, which will filter on the fly. So this HTTP endpoint that you give, you can apply a filter over here and you can get a filtered output, right?
Hmm.
So in the beginning, I suggest to start learning this and do learn Graph rather than the Azure MSOL or Azure AD or AZ.
Okay.
Azure AD will be deprecated in probably December. So maybe you
Okay.
don't want
Azure
to,
ready.
yep, the Azure AD endpoint, Graph
Mm-hmm.
endpoint.
Endpoint. Okay.
So prior to this, we had the Azure AD Graph endpoint. It was proper. So it was, I believe it was azure.microsoft.com/v1, right? But Microsoft has stopped putting any investment in that, and this URI will stop returning results if you use the old Azure endpoint. All right.
Hmm.
So that's why, I mean, put all your investment in this and start learning Graph. Now that's a PowerShell. So
Okay.
go, always know your technology first, which
Hmm.
is in this case Azure Active Directory. Then you
Correct.
work with Graph so that you can automate things and you can build solutions. Because you as a user or sorry, you as an administrator will not be able to do so many things in Azure Active Directory if you do things manually. So if I were to go here, let me just go to portal, PR. portal.azure.com. And if, let's say, your manager tells you, I want to find out all the users in my environment who are from Denmark, their country is Denmark, right? How would I do that over here? You would have to go over here, you would go to Azure Active Directory, then you would have to go to users, and you would then have to go through the attributes and then find out what each user is, right? Oh, not what each user is. Then you would have to find out what are the properties of that user. So let's say say John Doe. Now
Mm.
I don't have too many users. Let's say I have maybe 25 users. You would have to go over here and then find out, oh, let me check what John Doe is, right? And then you would check the attributes of John Doe and probably edit properties and then find out which country that person is from, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can do a full export of all the users, which I think they have now. They never used to have this earlier, where you could just download all users. Now you can download all users and then do a filter. Or if you want to create some automated solution, then you just write a command, right? Get hyphen mg user hyphen all, then you take pipe where, and then you have to put the where, then curly bracket dollar underscore dot country equal US or Americas or India, things like that, right? You can just
Mm.
write one command, or you would come here, download it, then do a filter in CSV, and then you can find that. So I prefer not doing this. I prefer always running that command and pulling the users and doing and then do the filter, because in the long run, that is what you would want, right?
Correct.
So the when your question was, should I concentrate on Azure or here,
PowerShell.
concentrate on both, yeah, on or PowerShell,
Mm-hmm.
focus on both, understand the
Mm.
technology, and then learn to automate with what you've learned, right?